So hello, everyone. I think we still have people joining, but I think we can start. So good morning, good afternoon, or evening. Welcome to this webinar launching the Mapping Africa Green Transition, Mapping Cooperation in Climate Finance. So my name is Amandine Yanguenon, and I'm the head of Geopolitics and Geoeconomics program at the Africa Policy Research Institute. First, I would like to start with a big thank you to our speakers for accepting our invitation, to the APRI team for supporting the organization of this event, Vincent, Dolphin, Lily, Esther, and Julius, and also to those who worked on the data collection and analysis for this mapping, Marius, Eli, Raphael, and also to everyone who made this mapping possible, Michaela, Stephen, Marco, and Marcos. And obviously, thank you to our PI for supporting this project, and especially Walker, Lina, and Anki. Let me maybe begin with a few words on why we decided to embark on this journey in October last year. First, I think for everyone, it's clear that there is an urgency of the climate because there is a climate crisis, and this climate crisis demands ambitious actions. If current trends continue, African countries could face major risk from the impact on rain-fed agriculture to growing water scarcity, rising frequency of extreme weather events. I would say on average, African countries are losing 2 to 5% of GDP, and many are diverting up to 9% of their budgets, responding to climate extremes. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of adaptation is estimated to be between $30 to $50 billion annually over the next decades, so 2 to 3% of the region GDP. So because of this vulnerability, we need ambitious climate mitigation and adaptation. Whether we already observed that African countries also face competing development priorities and limited access to finance, with the added challenge of avoiding unsustainable debt. In this context, there is a growing interest in innovative financing approaches, such as public-private partnerships and blended model. Initiatives like EU's Global Gateway is one of the examples of this trend. So what we are seeing, however, is that much of the investment is likely to flow towards Africa Green's mineral resources, often focused on extraction. This also opens up opportunities for downstream manufacturing and the use of green energy in industrial development and supporting the continent development prospects. Now, talking about geopolitics, we know that now global powers are competing for leadership in green technologies and for access to the materials that underpin them. With 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves, Africa is indispensable in this race to decarbonize. In recent years, we've seen an increase in minerals-related climate finance agreements between African countries and major partners, particularly China and the EU. This financing arrangement often support extraction, processing, and renewable infrastructure. Climate change is thus not only a tool for funding low-carbon transitions, but also a strategic instrument to secure access to resources essential for global decarbonization. Just a couple examples on the screen: the Global Gateway from the EU. Will leverage 150 billion between 2021 and 2027 in sustainable development sectors, including transport, climate, and energy. And as of November 2023, the Climate Action Tracker identified 95 climate projects in Africa with Chinese cooperation. And we heard also at the 2024 FOCAC, China announced $55 billion in funding to Africa under the Beijing Action Plan. More recently, also the Gulf countries have also stepped up their engagement. For instance, the UAE through International Holdings Company, and its subsidiary, International Resources Holding, has made major investments in copper, cobalt, lithium, and nickel, acquiring a majority stake in Zambia Mopani copper mines. In 2023, a lone Gulf-based company announced 73 FDI projects worth over $53 billion, mostly in the renewable energy sector. What actually remains unclear, or whether, is how African countries can best capitalize on these green investments, whether from China, the Gulf country, or the EU, to drive their climate ambition in ways that really support their priority. Specifically, we know very little about how these partners are engaging in green investment projects, what the current landscape looks like, and where the gaps, but also the opportunity lies, both for Africa and its external partners. So this is why actually we decided to launch this project. This project maps key investment and flagship projects that shed light on how the EU, China, and Gulf countries engage with Africa's green transition. And before moving into more detailed analysis in the second phase of this project, for now, what we are launching today is a mapping with the objective to collect data, compare it, and identify general trends. So you will see on the map, there is actually 2 layers, and this corresponds to 2 kinds of boxes. The first one is about economic and investment trends. So we look at trade balances, FDI flows, and overall economic linkage between select African countries and EU, China, and the Gulf countries. And to do this, we developed a standardized score that compared the intensity and quality of engagement relative to each African economy. So the investment and economic relations score is calculated as a weighted comparison of the balance of trade in goods from non-African state to African country. 2023 in the year is the one we selected in USD million, and the source is IMF, compared to local GDP, again, 2023 USD in million, and the source is the World Bank. And we added to the foreign direct investment from the non-African state to compare African country compared to local GDP. And with this percentage, we were able to identify trends, and this is the trends you can see on the mapping. The second layer is about green finance and investment cooperation, the second box you can see on the mapping. And this covers renewable energy projects, green manufacturing initiatives, and also climate finance flow. We have first primary data collected through direct collaboration with APRI's partners, as well as local research institutions. We had, for instance, a 2-hour working session in May this year with about 25 participants, and this was the idea to also use their knowledge and to share it with them and to complete our desktop research. The secondary resources we use include publicly available database, again, FDI statistics, IMF, World Bank indicator, trade data, also documentation coming from Eurostar, the World Resource Institute China database, and other foundations, and like Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, and the Heritage Foundation China Global Investment Tracker. But of course, we had some limitation with this. One of them is the data inconsistency. There is no clear distinction between pledge versus dispersed amounts, which prevent us from building annual time series. Also, the question of the coverage gap and overlaps. For instance, for GCC country, we lack sectoral and country breakdowns beyond our manual identification of data. And in addition, overlaps between bilateral and multilateral pipelines pose a double count risk. And the third limitation is also the lack of systematic data, because most data sets beyond multilateral sources lack a uniform project status code and lack socio-economic impact assessments, making it somewhat subjective to assign impacts to either energy or adaptation. So what we did, we start the project looking at the entire continent, but finally we decided to select a couple of countries actually 6. You can see them on the screen. The objective was to also select them depending on to making sure that we can have geographic diversity, economic variation, but also to reflect their different level of engagement at the diplomatic but also economic level with the three partners. Again, the data time frame for the data coverage was mostly from data from 2023 and supplementing with some of 2024 update data. In terms of partners, some of the caveats I can also mention here is that we treated AU as a single institutional actor for analytical coherence, and there was no difference between member states. This might be in for the next step. Except for a couple of when we were able to disaggregate the data. For Gulf country, you will see the mapping now at the moment is mainly focused on Saudi Arabia and UAE. And we finally decided not to use the Gulf countries council as an institution because for now they are really the two countries where there is the most engagements. And also for Gulf country, the shared drivers include economic diversification post-oil, but the idea was also to identify the one who supports for regional stability. And lastly, for China, we also treat China as a coherent single actors, meaning without real distinction between public and private, because it was the idea to reflect the centralized nature of this foreign economic policy and development strategy in Africa. So at the center of the project, you will see it on the map. It's really a visual mapping that showcases key investment and flagship initiatives of individual partners on climate finance in Africa, and as well as for those that are geared towards contributing to Africa green transition efforts. So this is the mapping at the moment. The collect data is depicted in an interactive online map. And I think maybe my colleague can put again the link on the chat. And this online map includes external partners' climate finance overview in Africa and their individual climate finance projects and investment in the 6 countries we just look at. Just now, very briefly, and also to stay the stage before we go into specific details with our speakers, but some of the key findings from the mapping. The first about the EU, we can say that EU, based on the database, again, this is really about the data we collected. It's not to cover the entire information available on the internet. The EU focuses on large policy-driven projects. A prime example is, for instance, the hydrogen initiative in Morocco, delivered from the Global Gateway Framework. And this approach leveraged Morocco's renewable cost advantage, positioning the EU to secure future green molecule imports while embedding climate and governance standards. We also observe that the EU's green industrial enablers model secure critical minerals and hydrogen corridors through stringent environmental, social, and governance rule-based partnerships, rather than asset control. And like China, its engagement is less about trade corridor and more about embedding patient capital into local economies. For EU, also observed that despite running a trade-off deficit of around 12.6 billion USD with the 6 countries studied, the EU channel a far larger volume through FDI. It's about 40 billion USD, or let's say 1.9% of their GDP. And the 6 flagship projects we identify in this project includes hydrogen, power grids, climate smart agriculture, and water management, reflecting the transition-focused strategy. For Gulf country, once again, now we only included Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and they position themselves as investor in frontier projects such as megacities and green hydrogen, moving quickly on bilateral deals through sovereign wealth funds, operating under lighter regulatory framework. Their capital is able to tolerate early stage risk, but environmental and social standards are more pragmatic than the EU stringent approach. I won't go into all the details and the numbers, you have them on the screen. And just also to flag that green manufacturing is still very limited. Only one project in our database, a Saudi-backed green ammonia plant in Morocco, directly fits this category, while the UAE has no standalone industrial investment recorded in our datasets. Lastly, for China, the strategic priority of Chinese cooperation is to lock in resource corridor and embedded Chinese technical norms in Africa by bundling finance with technology package to deliver renewables infrastructure and transmission lines. You can also see on the screen a couple of numbers. China follows a build the value chain model with multiple deals spanning upstream renewable generation, battery grade, chemicals, cathode fabrication, and final cell assembly. And we can also confirm that Beijing prioritization is the commercial corridor and resource access, and that financial engagement is driven largely by trade rather than equity. So now just as a final slide, and just to say what are we going as a next step, what we expect to do with this mapping. First, what we like to do is go one step further and to develop what we call the comparative advantage matrix, because these findings underline that we need to systematically understand the added benefits of each partnership. Each actor engaged with Africa's green transition in distinct ways, reflecting their own priorities, strengths, and constraints. But actually, in that no single partner cover the full spectrum of African countries' need, from financial to technology transfer and industrial development. So this is precisely the kind of step we want to have for the projects, especially to develop what we call this comparative advantage matrix. And we already identify a couple of criteria who could help us to refine this. And among one of the criteria, we have the geopolitical and trade influence, the financial capacity and tools, green manufacturing and technology, but also policy and regulatory supports. And here we want to use the matrix to really evaluate each partner's relative strength across these criteria. And the goal is not only to see not just who is investing, but also how, why they are investing and under what condition. And now going one step further, not only stick to the economic aspect, but also the geopolitical and political aspects. So it's really a joint exercise. So that's why we also plan to maybe have joint session with external partners, also to make sure that we can refine the matrix criteria and help answer the question of what form of cooperation between Africa we can develop with this selection of partners, which kind of cooperation are the most effective for which project and under which condition. So I really hope the data we've gathered provides a wealth of opportunity for analysis and deeper insights. Yeah, again, this is just the beginning and of what we envision as a collaborative project. Today, our goal is really to invite our guests, each speaker in their own field, to share their unique perspective and uncover additional insights that this mapping highlights. So without further ado, I will hand over to Luc Desnas. And once again, thank you, Luc, and thank you to all of our speakers for accepting our invitation. Thank you and enjoy this webinar. Over to you, Luc.
Thanks, Amandine. Great presentation and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luc Desnas. I work for the Resource Justice Network, so former Publish What You Pay. We just changed our name. I'll be moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, just a quick note, the session is being recorded, and I encourage you to share your insights and questions, comments, etc. on the live chat, because the microphone and camera used are not available during the whole session, but we gather the contribution and we address them during the Q&A at the end. So please share all of the questions you have. To enlighten us today, we have a pretty great panel with 4 amazing panelists. Sarah Logan, visiting fellow in the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Yunan Chen, research fellow in ODI's Development and Public Finance program. Dr. Muez Ali, research and policy lead at EarthNA. and Ebi Clark, Managing Partner at Frontier Alpha LLP. Our discussion will be structured around three sets of separate roundtables. The first round will start from the tool, not specifically APRI's tool, but the role of tools mappings like the one that Amandine just shared with us. My first question to our panelists will be, from your perspective, how can tools like this one on climate finance mapping improve our understanding of climate finance in Africa, and of the steps that should be taken to ensure that such tools and such dynamics track how external investments can support African interests and priorities. Let's go in the same order of presentation. So starting with Sarah Logan, each of you have only 3 minutes to answer this very complicated question. So please be brief. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I'll be brief and make sure I leave points for the others. So I think these tools are really, really helpful just in terms of getting a sense of what is happening where. You know, the prevalence of these investments, the geographic spread across countries, what different financing mechanisms are being used, and potentially, you know, co-financing structures. It really, I think, brings insight into where needs are being met and also where needs are not being met in terms of gaps. And so I think just in terms of being able to visualize where these projects are happening is really, really helpful. I think there's a lot that we would like to see in these tools, and making it happen is a lot more difficult than, you know, conceptualizing what we would like to see. But I think there's a key aspect from the African perspective to try and build in how these projects align with national priorities, and having that maybe as a sort of criteria that maps some of these projects onto national priorities. And obviously priorities change, but it is sort of a sense check. That would be good. And I think the point that Amandine raised about the data issues around like the social and environmental impact assessments, I think, you know, being able to incorporate something around impact data would be really, really helpful just in terms of what a project actually achieved, rather than maybe ex ante objectives, which tend to be available, but not the ex post impact evaluation information, which is quite rare with DFI investments, for example, even World Bank investments. And somehow bringing this data in would be really helpful, but there are big gaps in what's available and what a single tool can do. But I'll leave it there for now and just hand over to the others.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Over to you, Yunnan.
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations to Amandine and the team at APRI as well for this fantastic tour and all of the work that's gone into it. I will be brief, but I think, you know, this is a hugely valuable platform and an exercise to show, you know, not just how different actors are strategically investing in Africa, but also to show the diversity and to disaggregate on the ground. In breaking down, you know, the monolith that we talk about China-Africa or Gulf-Africa relations, but actually there is a huge diversity across the continent in how these actors are engaging, and also the different kinds of economic contexts, resource endowments, and as Sarah was saying, national priorities across these different economies. So having that data, building out that data, particularly in a context where misinformation and bad information is very rife, and I speak to this from the sort of China-Africa field, where you often see a lot of hyperbole around Chinese activities in Africa. I think one huge advantage of this platform as it develops and as it grows is the ability to kind of see the complementarities between these different external actors, right? This kind of holistic mapping can show where are there opportunities for complementary investments for African actors to strategically leverage different forms of investments and different instruments and different institutions, and also to ensure, as Sarah was saying, and to echo that, to make sure that these projects not only align with national priorities, but also what's happening at the continental level, at the regional level. How can these renewable projects and investments also tie into regional power infrastructure investments, and to support broader initiatives happening across the continent in supporting, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and support regional integration and economic integration in Africa. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That was very enlightening, and will be feeding into the conversation later on how Africa can best leverage the diversity of the actors that come in. Dr. Mwazali.
Thank you, Luke. I mean, I heard about the idea of the mapping a couple of months ago, and I'm very happy with how it's turned out. I think it's coming together really, really well. And I think these tools are always useful, and I think they can be even more useful in trying to identify suitable partners when it comes to investment. So, for example, I think one potential addition to this tool is if some of these kind of FDI inflows can be weighted or made more context specific. So having a trajectory of what is the increase in FDI flows, how has that increased since the GCC came in the picture versus when it used to be mostly China and EU, and I think also kind of weighting it against the size of the local GDP, right? Maybe against the debt burden of some countries. And I think because sometimes, historically, a lot of African countries have not benefited from FDI because there was kind of, weak absorption capacity within the economy when you have sudden inflows of high foreign direct investment. And that is always a recipe for disaster because it can open up spaces for exploitation and land grabs, etc. So I think, understanding how much money is coming in compared to how much money already exists, and what the historical flows have been, could really, help us kind of figure out who is potentially a useful partner, and how do some countries prepare when partners come in the future. How can they prepare themselves to make use or to make full use of this FDI? Thank you. I'll pass it over to Abby now.
Thanks a lot. Please, APRI, come in.
Thank you very much. The tool is a great idea. It'll show us what's working, and I think that's very important. The countries that I saw, I would say, from my perspective, are very different in terms of how easy they are to invest. So it's good to understand the context of national priorities, but I always sort of compare Nigeria with South Africa. And the difference between the two countries, even though we have very similar sized GDPs, is the role of the public and the private sector in our economies. So I think that there does need to be a context of what a country is trying to achieve. It's good to see what investors are looking at and to see whether it's going to be quarter by quarter or year by year what is working. But one of the contexts to rank the country by, and this is something that I'm working on, is what I would call the readiness of the domestic financial sector to absorb that money. And that's quite a complex thing. It's to do with the size of the banking sector, the size of the capital markets, or whether it's going to go through government. So I think that there is more of a country context to incorporate. But the benefit of these sorts of tools is that they will show quite clearly what is working and how finance is going from what is pledged to what is actually applied. So it's very useful. Thank you.
Interesting. From both your interventions, it pleads for maybe integrating a country absorption capacity template profile to the tool as it actually is. Let's now drive into the second part of the discussion that we were both actually pointing towards. Beyond the mapping, I would like this panel to help us gain a better understanding of the investment profiles of the EU, China, and Gulf countries in Africa, especially looking at the drivers. So the non-exhaustive list would be geopolitical, economic, environmental, strategic. Like there are a lot of drivers, but return on investment is only one of them, and it's rare. So yeah, behind the green transition, can each of you help us understand what are the financing approaches of the foreign partners, so grants, loans, FDI, and what political and economic dependencies the models risk creating for African states? And secondly, if you have time, please try to compare those actors and mechanisms onto who holds the strongest comparative advantage for both Africa's priorities and external partners' interests. Starting with Sarah Logan, as for the previous roundtable.
Thank you, Luke. So I'm going to look at the EU aspect here. And there are obviously a few different entities coming in terms of European investment. So they're the EU public institutions, the development finance institutions, and the private sector. So I'll just touch very lightly on them. In general, the public institutions, EU takes being a climate leader very seriously, and a lot of the, I would say, bilateral donor, so either the EU or the member state investments, which have often been in grant form, have been environmentally led in terms of priorities. We're seeing that changing more recently, where there is a shift towards more geopolitical and strategic investments, and also the exploration of different ways that public institutions can, I guess, support projects in areas of interest in African countries. For example, that would help them reduce their dependence on Chinese mineral supply chains, for example. So it's a time of exploration of new financing mechanisms from the public institution side. But in short, the public institutions can give grants. They can also support loans through the European Investment Bank, also through the development finance institutions of member states, either loan or equity investments. And in terms of the private sector involvement, it really needs to be commercially driven from the EU perspective. Like, projects need to be bankable. And I think this is where we're seeing a bit of a disconnect sometimes, where projects identified as geopolitically strategic for the EU also need to be bankable if you wanted to bring the private sector in. So it's a time of exploring how to make those projects work. I think certainly China has made this work years ahead of the EU, and has tools that the EU is still trying to develop in that space. But we are seeing progress there. And just in terms of, I guess, the availability of funding from the EU, I think just one useful thing to flag is this: the sustainable finance taxonomy of the EU currently does not include mining of critical minerals or transition minerals as a sustainable finance area. And this is, potentially an area that needs to be explored if finance from both DFIs, but also the private sector, is to be unlocked and to accompany more of the public financing. And I think maybe the last thing to say is that we are seeing quite an expansion of projects under the Global Gateway, but quite a few of them are relatively new. So we haven't yet seen how this plays out in terms of benefits back to the EU in terms of these geopolitical investments. It's clearer with some projects than others. So green hydrogen, for example, is an area where that green hydrogen can be exported back to the EU, and therefore, there's a sort of direct benefit in terms of geopolitical approach. With some of the other projects, it's less clear, and I think it's again an area that we're just seeing evolve. Like, how do what have sometimes been more traditional development aid type projects actually feed back in terms of benefit to the EU as they start thinking more in geopolitical terms? So there's a bit of variation across different types of projects in terms of how those reciprocal benefits come back to the EU.
Thank you, Sarah. I will probably have questions on how you frame bankability in this respect. Please, Yunnan, give us your input on the Chinese strategy in climate finance over the continent.
Sure. So, of course, we're all very cognizant of China's very visible presence in the African continent over the last 2 decades. And that has manifested in initiatives like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's only in the last 5 to 10 years or so that I think we've seen the growing salience of climate finance, and particularly green finance and green cooperation in China's overseas engagement in Africa. And we're in the last 5 years, particularly in the post-COVID era, we're seeing a growth in this kind of narrative around the Green Belt and Road Initiative. And also to note, at the most recent COP, there was also the announcement from China's vice premier of how it had already committed and mobilized almost 25 billion in climate finance to support countries' climate responses since 2016. So in all of these policy signals, it's very clear that climate cooperation is rising in China's strategic engagement with developing countries and also in Africa. When you look back at how China's overseas finance more generally, as well as its climate finance specifically has been implemented, mostly this has taken the form of bilateral lending and debt finance. A lot of these Belt and Road Initiative projects over the last 15 years have come in the form of export credit loans and insurance from Chinese policy banks and official institutions, as well as guaranteed loans from its commercial banks. And so these are largely commercially financed infrastructure projects. You also have a smaller component of climate finance that was channeled through the MDB system and also financed through regional institutions like the African Development Bank. And of course, there's also a huge role that's played by Chinese SOEs and clean tech companies, which I could write a whole list of all of the Chinese solar power companies now that really dominate the market and have been the biggest exporters of these clean technologies and that are also increasingly active in Africa. I think what's important to note is, however, that there's really been a shift in the last 10 years of how China engages, and so I think this kind of comparative exercise that we're doing here is a really, really timely one, because China's overseas finance and this kind of bilateral lending that I've been talking about has seen a steep decline even prior to COVID. in the last 10 years, and quite a shift qualitatively away from the very sort of state-driven, let's say geopolitically driven nature of some of these BRI investments towards a much more commercial orientation. And this is manifested in the rising participation of commercial banks and SOEs becoming financiers themselves, as well as a shift in narrative away from debt instruments towards mobilizing investment and the use of FDI increasingly in supporting some of these projects. So this, I think, is an important shift to recognize that China is actually stepping back in some ways and taking a much more risk conservative approach, even as actors like the EU and the Gulf are perhaps rushing into this market. And a lot of these drivers around China's new interest in green, as well as this risk conservatism, also reflects what's happening at home. Right? China's own economy is in a very different position to where it was 10 years ago. And its own domestic investment in clean tech and green technologies has become a huge part of its economic growth trajectory, and Africa can potentially be a beneficiary of these green spillovers that we're seeing. I'll just conclude very briefly to talk about I think some of the benefits and risks. Right, I think China's main advantage for Africa is not necessarily financial right now, but really in the technology that it's bringing. This is the low-cost clean tech, the solar panels, the capacity and expertise that it has in these sectors, as well as its ability to provide low-cost construction and contracting services. You see Chinese EPCs everywhere. They are very ubiquitous, even if it's not necessarily a Chinese finance project. And this technology and capacity is going to be essential for any kind of green transition. But I think it also brings some risks of dependence on these technologies. And this is, I think, where we need to open the conversation around localization and supply chain integration. But there's also, I think, risks in this context of growing geopolitical competition, where US-China relations are becoming a lot more volatile. Like, what does it mean for African countries to tie themselves in potentially into a path-dependent technological partnership with Chinese standards and Chinese technologies? Thank you.
So that's it's very interesting. I know you might have to leave early, but I have so many questions about the phenomenon you were describing on China being a bit more risk-averse and profit-oriented, with a lesser role of public finance in the overall strategy. Dr. Mwezali, please, I give the floor to you. And please be as brief as you can, because we're already really late.
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to the GCC investments. I know the tool kind of lumps them together for, obviously for convenience sake and probably because of kind of limited data availability. But GCC countries have very different approaches to their investments in sub-Saharan Africa. But the general kind of, one way you can kind of summarize their broader approach is that financing tends to be government-led. So whether it's through sovereign wealth funds or state investment vehicles, it tends to be, their approach is very bilateral. So they negotiate kind of with governments as opposed to partnering up with different private sector entities. And they negotiate with governments for land leases and other concessions. And investments tend to be very focused on returns. So, and you can probably see from the portfolio of investments that you've pulled up in that there are way more investments in non-kind of clean energy sectors or in non-green sectors. I mean, historically, one major sector was agriculture. And recently, an African Export-Import Bank report, Afrexim Bank report on GCC investments in sub-Saharan Africa has shown that between 2012 and 2022, 2/3 of GCC investments in Africa actually went to Egypt, or almost 2/3 went to Egypt. And the same report shows that just over 1/3 of these investments were in the construction sector. And Egypt has this booming construction sector, especially when it comes to tourism. So they tend to be very much focused on returns, as opposed to focused on specific kind of sectors. They obviously do focus on sectors that they know well. So that's why the UAE invests in a lot of port infrastructure through DP World and Abu Dhabi ports. And more recently, Qatar, which is not included in the database, but potentially might be in the future, invest in logistics infrastructure, specifically when it comes to airports and airlines. But I mean, the focus on returns probably explains why only a subset of these investments, a small subset of these investments, are on green investments. And the big green investments tend to be in Southern Africa. And I think two of the biggest ones are in South Africa, which kind of indicates that, they look for maybe bigger economies, more reliable partners, more safety when it comes to investments in the renewable energy sector. They have a much more diversified portfolio when it comes to non-green energy investments. Right, so there are kind of investments in Mozambique for offshore gas, with Namibia, in Nigeria. So it's much more diverse when it comes to non-green energy. But the most important thing is that Saudi Arabia, UAE, and potentially Qatar each has their own approach, and potentially that approach can be explained, and some have attempted to explain it in the past through basically domestic priorities and their own kind of ambitions for their economies in the future. And you have to understand that a lot of this is quite new for the GCC. 10, 15 years ago, they were generally quite comfortable. But then, the increasing pressures from climate change and the decarbonizing world has forced them to rethink their own growth strategies. And you can see that a lot of their investments are driven by domestic priorities because a lot of the projects are focused on the agricultural sector, which is because they are very much concerned about food security because they can't all produce their own food. So there are a lot of domestic drivers for their decisions in the type of sectors that they invest in and how much money they invest into it. And then the levels of investment or the amount of money flowing into the continent from the GCC can also be explained from the same lens, right? So the UAE is much more aggressive, whereas Saudi Arabia, which has a longer history of relationships and investment and overseas development assistance with sub-Saharan Africa, is much more measured, much more calm. And I think because the UAE kind of sees a decarbonized economy in the future as a greater threat. Saudi Arabia has much more leverage when it comes to the oil and gas sector. And Qatar is much more relaxed as well because it's one of the biggest producers of gas, which is technically, quote unquote, a cleaner fuel. So there are a bunch of reasons why they adopt different approaches. In terms of whether they might be good or bad trade partners or investors for the African continent, I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends what African countries are prioritizing. But I think there are risks involved in either of these players. So whether it's the Gulf countries, China, or the EU, there are risks involved with all three when it comes to investments. So I don't think particularly Gulf countries are particularly better investment partners than the other two. And one potential, I'll wrap up really quickly, one potential threat that I see for African countries is that the preceding models available to new investors like the GCC have been set by China, Europe, the US, right? And, I don't know about you guys, but these models don't seem to be working, right? So I think if they jump on these models and start to build on them, it could potentially be detrimental to the African continent. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And to give us a perspective from the continent, please, Evi Pere, can you follow up?
I like how it was put that, everyone does a little bit of everything and it might not quite fit. So realistically, it has to be up to the Africans to decide which part of the buffet we would like to choose from. Now, I have to sort of speak from just my own experience. I did leave government 2 years ago. And what's very clear is that from all three parties, and I'll even put ASEAN and Japan in here, there has been a change in the approach to Africa from all trade groups. And they've all got slightly different risk tolerances. And if we were to assume a private sector deal, then we'd like to assume that all areas would find that deal agreeable. So I'm going to really talk about where a government would come in, either on the investment side or on the investee side. I'm going to use a sweeping brush. If you want grants and guarantees, you go to the EU. The EU is a sort of the three, is the one most likely to say, oh, here's a grant, we'll help with project preparation, we'll help you with trying to create the legal commercial environment to make this project work. I mean, no disrespect to the GCC or China, that isn't the sort of thing that they do. So that's where, from the African point of view, we would see the EU as having an advantage. All three do roughly different parts of the value chain of investment, but in that part, it would be the EU. Clearly, without a shadow of doubt, the debt, that's China. If you want something big, infrastructural, if you want it built, then of the three, you would go to China. And that is where, realistically, their competitive advantage is. Now, the GCC, I've not had that much experience with, but they've come in the last 3 years when I've been out of government. But from what I've seen of them, they would make very good equity partners if they agreed with the project. So strangely enough, all three do a wide range, but where they have their advantages are in slightly different parts. And depending upon the project, depending upon the African country, depending upon the relationship of public sector, private investment, I do think that it's dependent upon the recipient country to pick out and design that project in such a way that we find the right partners for the right part of the investment process. And each of the partners has, from my point of view, of what I've seen in the last 3 years, really quite different strengths. As was mentioned, the only one that's going to talk to us about a taxonomy right now is the EU. That's as simple as that. The Gulf won't be too worried. China, not yet. So once we start, as Africans, designing our project, I think we can find partners for different processes. And what that leads to is how we structure that project. Do we bring all parties in at the beginning? Do we bring them in as we're going along? How do we make the best advantage of the different skills that they bring in? And that's what I would like to say as recipients.
Thanks a lot. And you opened the floor for the final round of questions, because perhaps most importantly, we need to finally look into, let's say, the African bargaining power in climate finance, and how this bargaining power can be seen by external partners. So I'd like all of you, very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time left, to answer 2 questions. First, how do you perceive African autonomy and bargaining power in climate finance, and how should external partners rethink their investments on that basis? And secondly, more specifically, do you see concrete real openings for Africa to set its terms in project design? And to the contrary, where do you see external partners as pure reshapers of Africa's role? So imposing their plans, desires, and objectives on the continent. Please be as brief as possible. Sarah, you start.
Sure, thanks, Luke. I think there does seem to be quite a variation in, I guess, bargaining power across different issues within climate finance. And just painting very broad brushes here, but I think that African countries seem to have greater leverage on issues that meet the needs of external partners. So they have something that external partners want. It gives them a bit more negotiating room. It also makes it an area of greater negotiating contention, I guess, that if not handled well, could be an area where external partners impose their agenda on African countries. So I think it's a bit contradictory, but those areas where that they really have something to offer an external partner is both an area of leverage and need to be careful, because it's an area where you could have things imposed on you if not handled well. I think there's some areas that there does seem to be less leverage. These would be areas that fall more into, I guess, the traditional development aid sectors where you're needing that grant funding. That these are not like, commercial investments, but you are needing, the cheaper grant funding, and the scope to be able to leverage that, I think, is not as great. But that's just been my view so far. I'd be keen to hear from the others.
Yunnan, over to you.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief, but to echo, I think where bargaining power is a highly varying concept between different countries, between different kinds of economies, depending on their own economic context, where their development trajectory is going, and also their geopolitical relationships and strategic linkages with these different external actors. You have some countries, Egypt comes to mind, that is really booming in terms of how attractive it is to all of these different kinds of external investors. And then other countries do not have that same sort of agency or scope for maneuver in trying to leverage these external resources. I think the other factor to say on some of these economies, including the ones that are part of this mapping exercise, and also countries that we've studied at ODI, is that we're also in the context of a debt crisis in Africa that's still being resolved. Economies like Zambia, despite their significant mineral resources and capacity to kind of strategically leverage their advantage in these critical minerals, they're also in a position where that kind of debt finance that they enjoyed from particularly from Chinese and other international commercial creditors in the past, it's no longer feasible as a model. It's still trying to resolve its debt restructuring, and as a consequence, from work that we've done as well, some of these green projects that get pledged don't materialize. And so we need to shift models, and this is also a message for the external investors as well, right? That that needs to be different financing modalities that leverage direct investment where companies rather than financiers or banks take on the project risk, and also opportunities for co-financing between different creditors and between some of these different international partners, and we see that already in some cases. I think of examples between Chinese contractors and SOEs with Gulf project developers in South Africa, which has been one case of this kind of use of complementarity, and I think looking for opportunities for more of this kind of co-financing. There is a role and a potential opportunity for African actors to play a stronger coordinating function in bringing in these different partners through a sort of country platform style of cooperation, and setting the agenda first rather than being dictated to on the scope or nature of that investment.
Thank you. Dr. Moisali?
Thank you, Luke. This is a very difficult question. I mean, I've been thinking about it for the last couple of years, and I honestly have no idea. I have no clue how this could be done. I thought about, kind of, negotiating collectively. That hasn't worked well in the past. Issues like the huge debt burden that a lot of African countries suffer from doesn't really help. And, I mean, and the reason I've been thinking about it is because, in Sudan, we recently went through a political transition, and we had a kind of an installed civilian government after a long couple of decades of dictatorship. And, during that time, what could this government have done to attract FDI under its own conditions, right? It had very little to work with, right? It was highly indebted to international financial institutions. It needed to appeal to the IMF and World Bank in order to be eligible for the highly indebted poor countries initiative. It had some, debts that nobody knew about to China. The EU was trying to help, but they were very wary. The US didn't think the transition was going to succeed. It did fail, but, so they were kind of, so it was almost too hot to touch. And so in a position like that, how do you dictate terms of trade in terms of investment, if you're very desperate? And to be honest, I have no idea. Like, I don't know what the solution is. And, sometimes if you're lucky, you have, interests from elsewhere. So for example, I know the EU is really interested in green hydrogen, and there's a lot of money kind of monitoring Namibia as a potential source of hydrogen for greening the industrial sector in Europe, specifically in Germany. So in that sense, yes, right? The EU wants something, Germany is desperate for it so it can decarbonize its own economy, then that gives Namibia some leverage. But I think otherwise it's very difficult given the state of most economies in the continent and the level of debt that most African countries have kind of accrued over time. It's difficult for them to set terms for investments. I'm here to hear other suggestions, but I honestly I don't have any great ideas.
Well, Viviere, I hope you will have a bit of a more optimistic approach to counterpoint Mr. Ali.
I would first of all agree that it's very difficult. I would also add that it's generally unlikely. And the reason for that is, in order to have agency, then you really do have to have a longer term strategy. And without that longer term strategy, generally, most governments would look at things transaction by transaction at a time. And despite being what I would say the beautiful bride at the moment, there'd even be competition between countries as to who would get that next piece of transaction. So the only way to have agency is to have confidence in a longer term country plan. And that requires the country itself to have a longer term development plan. So in the absence of a longer term outlook, it's really hard to understand how, as a recipient country, you would be able to maintain agency given transactions happening in countries in your continent, demands to get something done. That being said, if you were to have that longer term plan, then I think there are certain examples that one can look at which point in the right direction. For Nigeria, I always say, what would have happened if, say, NNPC 20, 25 years ago had really been reformed? And that's the sort of thing that needs to come in. Is a country prepared to change its legislation? Is a country prepared to present, financial legislation and regulation to support external investment? All of these things do take time. And realistically, I can't imagine most governments being able to achieve them in a single term. So that is why they don't happen. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And if it was to be done, then, you are going to look at things like, if we were to take mining, some sort of joint ventures between, the country itself to hold perhaps a golden share, other entities in the country to do, value added. But all of these require a level of planning that most politicians will not be able to afford. And that's where it comes in. So we have to probably work with what we've got. And therefore, it probably will tend more towards a transaction basis than what I would call a development strategy basis. It's unfortunate, but that's more likely.
Thanks a lot. To open the Q&A, I would like to actually start from a question that starts directly on both Dr. Mwazali and Oliver Clark's points. Points and counterpoints. Comment dire? I was surprised not to hear at all about Africa 50 because it's been discussed quite a bit recently. And it's true that countries individually have very low bargaining power, and that political actors have a very short, not attention span, but a very short return on investment tolerance. If Africa needs long-term and collective action plans, how would an organization, would a body like Africa 50, an agreement, could allow to actually shift the tendency towards climate financing being driven, being designed by Africa, and then having external actors coming in to fit, as you were saying earlier, on the grants, the debt, and the equity. And I'm asking first to you, but then to all our panelists.
Is that first to me? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Oh my God. Yes. Right.
Yes, it's it's the sort of thing that the EU would help us with. This goes back to that, which is trying to design. If I was to take Nigeria as an example, one could either do it in Nigeria or perhaps try to look at an ECOWAS approach. The problem with that is obviously the more countries you bring in, the less likely it is to happen in a reasonable time. I would say that if you look at the larger economies, it's probably best to focus on them because there are just too many countries. So, a country like South Africa might be able to, South Africa, Egypt, the larger countries and sort of ask them, do they want a development strategy over the next 20 to 30 years that brings in continuous foreign investment as partners in development? And then it's to really work out what the country is looking for in itself, both in terms of the government's involvement in that development and also the private sector's involvement in that development. I think you'll get very different answers from the top 6 countries, like I said, based upon the actual structure of the economies as they are. And the next aspect that I would look at is very much the macro side of it. There is really, due to the fiscal capacities of the countries, there's what I would always say is a maximum rate of investment. I think that all of the countries, that there are a lot of numbers that are bandied around as to how much investment Africa needs. And there's no question that it needs that level of investment, but the people who invest need their returns back. And this creates a stress on the balance of payments. So how likely is the current balance of payments architecture in each of these large countries able to accommodate the investment flows and the expected investment returns? With a sort of balance of both of those, you will get an idea of what sort of partnerships are possible or reasonable. And, realistically, most people who will go and invest will be looking for hard currency returns at first until we can perhaps demonstrate that, local currency returns are stable, which they may be over a longer term plan. But that's the sort of approach that I would take. Look at what I would call the speed limit of the economy and what the governments and the local stakeholders in the country are prepared to cooperate with external investors in that country. I hope that makes sense. I've tried to be quite political.
It does. Dr. Mwazali, do you see some hope in inter-country collaboration and especially in inter-IFI collaboration? Or do you have a similarly pessimistic view on those endeavors?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, I agree with everything that Ebi has said. I mean, and to his point, I think one great example of the successful of a successful kind of implementation or adoption of a long-term national strategy or development strategy is Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So that was framed as a national project. It was part of this long-term development plan. And when they were initially raising money for it and they went to the big IFIs, there were some conditions put up front in order for them to get the money. And they were like, look, no, this is a nationalist project. We are going to fund this ourselves if you're not going to give us the money under, on our own conditions. And so they left it. And they raised money internally. They got some money from China. And then once they've accumulated a lot of enough money to get the project going, and everyone knew that this was going to happen, now they were in a stronger position, a negotiating position, and then went back again to the IFIs and said, look, you can fund us now if you want, but these are our conditions. And it turned out, and it eventually worked out. And that's the advantage, this is one example of Ebi's kind of framing of what the importance of long-term development strategies. But I don't see any potential in kind of inter-country kind of collaboration or potentially regional negotiations. Not because I'm being cynical, but it just hasn't worked out in the past, right? There's a lot of diversity. Has it worked out, Ebi?
No, I would agree with you. I just wanted to follow on afterwards when you finished. I would just like to make a point.
Okay. So there's a lot of diversity. There are internal politics. And like Abby mentioned, politicians have limited, if they are elected, they have limited time in office. And a lot of this stuff is kind of long term. So it's kind of difficult kind of bringing all of these things together. And everything kind of, all the stars aligning for you to eventually get what you want out of these investments. And not to mention what Abby mentioned about the kind of the local environment being ready for these, for this type of money coming in. Over to you, Abby.
The point that I wanted to make is that, as Africans, we should be able to, or I'd like to think, and I'm confident we can convince each other to invest in ourselves more likely than convincing someone outside of Africa to invest. So there should be more of Nigeria saying, South Africa, you've got massive capital markets. Do you want to invest in me? Everyone out of the extra-continental has all these conditions. Do you have a set of less onerous conditions? And I actually do think that there's a potential internal circuit of investment that we haven't yet capitalized on as a continent.
Just quickly, I would like to go back to a question that was asked to Yunan Sen, because it feeds into the conversation. When you were saying that there needs to be a model shift away from the debt model, there was a first question asking if you were talking about going toward more of an equity model, because down the line you said that co-financing by external partners, so collaboration outside of Africa, could produce less debt. And I think that our auditors do not know why that is.
Thank you for the question. I think just to clarify a few things, there is a model shift in how China is approaching its overseas finance, and this is as a consequence of its own domestic risks in its own financial sector, and also the real consequences of some of how these BRI projects have played out on the ground, right? Some of these projects have not generated the returns they were supposed to in order to pay back the loan. Many African governments now are facing debt service constraints as well that really limits their ability to take on a lot more debt. So there's a couple of things happening here. One is that I think China has moved away from this the policy bank driven infrastructure finance model of years past. That was quite risky. It put a lot of risk on a single financial institution, and we're seeing a shift towards diversifying that risk and sharing it with other financiers through co-financing. There is a lot of demand for that, and also in sharing it with the private sector. In the kind of similar way to the kind of private capital mobilization narrative that we saw in traditional donor circles. I think there's a similar thing happening in the Chinese architecture, where there is a huge push for the contractors, the SOEs and companies themselves to take on a bigger share of the project risk, including through equity in these kinds of new PPP models. Kenya's SGR second phase is one example of this. It's still in the negotiation phases now, but the proposed financing structure is very, very different from the first first iteration, which was a sort of standard BRI debt finance model from China Exim Bank. The next phase is going to involve a much more diversified set of actors that includes commercial banks as well as contractors taking on equity as investors. And this kind of investment model can help reduce debt risks because it's essentially a sort of concession that the company would be managing. There's more incentives as well for the company to make sure that the project generates returns, right? Avoiding some of that moral hazard issue. But it's still yet to be seen how feasible these kinds of structures are and how attractive they are for investors. I think there's still a lot of risk aversion from Chinese financiers as well as investors for depending on the country context, and so ensuring that there's a strong enabling environment and strong investment frameworks within the country is key. And I think another area in which, you know, international cooperation can help, and tying into what's also been said is that, you know, supporting external support for African financial institutions and African investors to play a bigger role is one area where Gulf, China, EU can all have a positive sum contribution, right? Supporting the regional development banks as well as the smaller sub-regional development banks, or you know, your AFC style institutions as a way to share risk, but also strengthen financing vehicles within the continent to play a bigger role.
Thank you. I'd like to quickly come back to a question that was asked quite a while before, when Sarah was speaking about the different comment dire, flows coming from the EU and where Africa had most bargaining power, which could be summarized in the sentence that cheap capital doesn't come to no cost. Like cheap capital, with cheap capital comes no bargaining power, or little bargaining power. But you then, still talking to you, Sarah, talked about the fact that there's not yet sustainable finance of mining at the EU level, and we're well aware of it because the dual gateway is about everything but extraction. I was wondering how, comment dire, can you envision a bargaining power in those deals playing on mineral wealth? This maybe sounds a bit Trumpist of me to ask that question, but could the cost of capital be shifted to mineral wealth to allow countries that cannot afford high capital cost to actually bargain a bigger role in the project?
Thanks, Luke. Just to, I just want to make sure I understood the question. So this is, you know, could African countries better leverage their mineral wealth for, I guess, better terms and investments? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think there is scope that this can be done. I mean, I think it comes back to the issue a bit that APRI and Muez was speaking about, that, you know, also around collective bargaining power, where ultimately it devolves to a project by project basis for negotiations, which makes it very difficult to really push collective bargaining. And obviously, once each country is now negotiating for themselves, your ability to leverage your wealth is harder. I think the other really tricky thing is that the mineral markets are just very, very difficult for host countries. You know, its prices are going up and down. It is extremely competitive. It is really, really difficult to consider trying to build out domestic value addition projects in African countries when we have an overcapacity of existing processing facilities in China, and the difficulty with competing with that. And it comes back to, you know, African countries would like to leverage their wealth for value addition investments, but the market is really difficult, like beyond the factors in that specific country. So I think it's, in theory, it's great. It could work, but in practice, it's very difficult. I think you have to have a very high market share of like global trade in that commodity. So like DRC and cobalt has some degree of weight in the same way that we see Indonesia with nickel. But just because minerals are quite important to African economies does not mean that they are big global suppliers necessarily. And this is the tricky thing. I think it would be ideal if we could better negotiate, but we also can't overplay our hands as African countries because we're actually not as big suppliers as like individually as we need to be in order to throw that weight around. So it's not a very optimistic answer. I wish there was greater room for leverage, but I think the nature of the market, the difficulty with investments in anything downstream from mining, and also the fact that African countries are so dependent on these, exports of these commodities that it's difficult to risk it all for a drastically different deal. So not very optimistic, but I think there is room for improvement. It needs to be very well considered, and no, drastic changes in the investment environment, as Yunan mentioned. I mean, those sort of things will really weaken African countries' bargaining power when you are, changing the policy environment continuously. But it's possible, but within bounds of realism, I think.
Thank you so much. It sounds like regional integration and African leadership in project finance are both silver bullets and hard to hope for in the near term from all of your perspectives. We are now reaching the end of this panel. Could you please give your closing remarks in a very synthetic manner? I wasn't as strict as I should have been on time management. Let's start with you, Sarah.
I don't really have a huge amount just to say in addition, just that I think it's a very rapidly evolving space, obviously, climate finance, and cooperation between African countries, as difficult as it is, needs to happen more. I think one area that we need to look at is sort of regional value addition facilities rather than each country trying to build out their own. I think it's an area of some promise, given how competitive the sector is. It's not going to be viable, each country to build out their own smelters and refineries. And it's an area that I think there could be some real cooperation if we can get a benefit sharing arrangement that benefits all the participating countries. What that looks like, I think we need to explore, but it's just to highlight that as an area that I do think we need to focus on more.
Thank you so much. Yunan, over to you.
Thank you, and I think just to say congrats again for the mapping platform and this kind of important work that you're convening here, and also in bringing together all of these different perspectives. It's really important to flesh out, our understanding and knowledge in this very rapidly evolving space where there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of hype, but there isn't a lot of quality data. I think something that we haven't really raised, and what I want to emphasize is that, in tracing climate finance, we think we also need to think more about the wider enabling infrastructure and the financing needs for, I'm thinking of power systems, for grid capacity, and that enabling infrastructure that will be essential if we are to accelerate a broader energy transition and investment in renewables. And this is not something that's very well captured in current discussions around climate taxonomies, but building out grid capacity to be able to absorb new renewable investments, ensuring stability of these power networks, and supporting regional power infrastructure as well, so that energy systems can also help support broader regional economic integration within the continent. I think these are also areas where this kind of mapping of all of these different partners can make a real contribution. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Dr. Mwezali?
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, thanks again for having me on this webinar. I think I want to echo what Yunan said, that this is a great tool, and I think as it develops over time, it will be very useful both to researchers and potentially to investors and policymakers. I think just final words, just to confirm something that Abby mentioned earlier, that investor perception reports tend to show that local investors have much higher risk appetites. So there is a lot of local money that can be invested. But I think when it comes to collective bargaining, the first step of collective bargaining should be to negotiate better trade and finance conditions for African countries. And the way trade and financial regulatory infrastructure is structured today, advantages gives advantages to those who already have the capital, to those who have already built up their infrastructure. And so the African continent is still playing kind of catch up. So I think the first step with collective bargaining would be negotiating better trade and conditions and better financial financing conditions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And finally, Didier Clark.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to reiterate, I think this tool is great, and it will, if it shows what's working and what's flowing and what's moving, it would present a picture that currently now is just driven by, it's either data or anecdote. At the moment, we tend to run a lot of things by anecdote. It would be good to actually see data to actually back up what works, and that's exceptional. What I think this whole discussion has shown is that there is a balance of partnerships, whether you want to call them regional, intercontinental, or external, that perhaps African governments should be a bit more proactive in investigating themselves. It's clear that there are different risk profiles, and realistically, if African governments are to look for development partners, then they have to find those partners most applicable to the risks that they want to share. So no, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Thanks a lot. So this was a wonderful panel. I don't know if Amandine, you want to say something, but we don't have a lot of time.
Yes, no, just a quick thank you, and also a thank you to you, Luke, for moderating this panel, so nothing more. I just saw that there was a question about how do we plan to expand the case study. So we will start with the 6th one we already selected, especially to make sure that we cover one of the aspects AB mentioned, meaning that the readiness of this country. I think this is something that we really want to explore for the next step. But yeah, let's stay tuned, and then thank you again for this wonderful launch, and thank you for your contribution. So thank you again, take care, and
thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, everyone.